Exciting announcement! Join me at the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival. Hey everyone, I have some incredible news to share with all of you. I am absolutely thrilled to announce that I will be attending the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival this year. The festival is an amazing gathering of passionate podcasters, enthusiasts, and experts who are all dedicated to exploring the fascinating realms of true crime and the paranormal. But it's not just about spooky stories and thrilling mysteries. It's about something much more important. The festival focuses on advocacy and ethics in true crime and paranormal podcasting. It's a platform where we can come together, share knowledge, and discuss the responsible and respectful ways to approach these sensitive subjects. I can't express how excited I am to be a part of this event. I'll have the opportunity to meet fellow podcasters, engage in thought-provoking discussions, and learn from some of the most brilliant minds in the industry. It's an experience you won't want to miss. And guess what? I have an exclusive offer for all of you amazing followers and listeners. Use my special coupon code, Lanie, during registration at truecrimepodcastfestival.com, and you'll receive a fantastic 15% discount on your tickets. So mark your calendars, gather your fellow true crime advocates and paranormal enthusiasts, and join me at the True Crime and Paranormal Podcast Festival. Let's celebrate our shared love for these intriguing genres while embracing the importance of ethics and advocacy within the podcasting community. I can't wait to see you all there. Don't forget to use my coupon code, Lanie, for that awesome discount, and I'll see you soon. Welcome back to It's Haunted, What Now? I'm your host, Lanie. And today's show is a special treat as we join forces with the incredible Chris from the They're Not Shadows podcast. And I want to thank Chris for inviting me to collaborate on this fun venture that combines the best of our haunted worlds. Before we delve into the eerie tales awaiting us, let me shout out the exceptional podcast featured in today's episode. These shows are a must-listen for any paranormal aficionado. So follow, like, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast fix. First, we have the Ghost Story Guys, whose spine-tingling narratives will send shivers down your spine. Then we Need to Talk About Ghost dives deep into haunted happenings, leaving no stone unturned. Prepare to be captivated by Weekly Creep, where strange and unsettling stories come to life. If you're brave enough to venture further, You See Me in the Dark will take you on a terrifying journey through the unknown. Haunted Happenstance presents chilling tales from history with a supernatural twist, while real-life ghost stories brings haunting encounters straight from the experiences of everyday people. Of course, we must remember the host of this eerie collaboration, the They're Not Shadows podcast, who brought us together for this ghoulish gathering. And last but certainly not least, we have the hauntingly mesmerizing Southern Gothic, where Southern legends and lore come alive. So whether you're a longtime fan of It's Haunted What Now or a curious newcomer joining us for the first time, prepare for a night of chilling tales and special encounters. Sit back, dim the lights, and let's embark on this otherworldly adventure together. Get ready, dear listeners, because it's about to get hauntingly real. Okay, ready to get spooked? Our first story comes from an anonymous listener, and I want to warn you now. Prepare to be gripped by a tale that delves into the unsettling experiences of a mother and her daughter, taking us on a journey into the mysterious realms of childhood imagination and the inexplicable. When my daughter was between the ages of 4 and 6, she introduced us to her imaginary brother, Billy. He became an inseparable part of our lives, always included in our conversations and activities. According to her, Billy would even appear with black hair and a tall, thin figure in her dreams. He was portrayed as being slightly older than her. Simultaneously, she developed an intense fear of demons lurking in her bedroom. She frequently came to me in tears, claiming she could hear them. I would reassure her, attributing those sounds to normal house noises. However, no matter what I said, she found it difficult to believe me. She refused to sleep in her room for several years, instead seeking solace in mine. It's worth noting that my grandmother passed away in that same room when I was young. Interestingly, my daughter's birthday falls just 2 days before my late grandmother's birthday, and I often pondered what her natural birth date might have been. While it may be unrelated, one can't help but wonder if a death in a room leaves a lasting impact on its energy or openness. On another occasion, I caught my daughter staring at the ceiling, claiming to see peculiar symbols. I dismissed it as a visual phenomenon where staring at an image for too long could create an afterimage. But she insisted it wasn't the case and drew the symbols. Strangely, they resembled ancient symbols with intricate designs, making it unlikely that they resulted from simple image burnout. As my daughter turned 6, her imaginary brother Billy seemingly faded away, coinciding with the arrival of her cousin Lily. With the company of her cousin, she appeared less lonely as an only child, and her conversations about Billy became less frequent. However, her fear of demons persisted, and she remained incredibly clingy. She slept in my room until she turned 11, and even during showers, she insisted that I stay nearby, as she believed showers could inadvertently summon a demon. This year, as she turned 12, everything changed. Her entire demeanor and personality underwent a 180-degree transformation. She now prefers to stay locked in her room most of the time, and the mere act of me opening her door while she showered would mortify her. For several months, she hasn't mentioned anything about demons, but at the same time, she has become more closed off and rarely shares her thoughts or feelings with me. Recently, I overheard her video chatting with a friend, and their conversation caught my attention. Her friend asked what would happen if she were to tell me about something, and my daughter responded, thinking I wouldn't believe her and perhaps even consider her crazy. She then mentioned something about her childhood imaginary friends, wondering if they were now residing in a kind of graveyard. Initially, I dismissed it as a typical middle school attention-seeking type of behavior, pretending to have imaginary friends or hearing voices. However, her friends seemed understanding and open-minded. The conversation shifted shortly after, so I decided to let it go. But today, a thought struck me like lightning. What if my daughter sees something? A quick edit. Since sending this, I've had some significant updates to share. Tonight, I mustered the courage to ask her about it. I explained the hallway encounter and noticed her panic, assuming I had overheard something I shouldn't have. But as she realized the nature of my inquiry and my willingness to suspend disbelief, she eagerly opened up. I wish I had recorded the conversation because she spoke sincerely and passionately. Her eyes were locked in a distant gaze as if she were recounting a real story, effortlessly describing her experiences without pause. She talked about having several friends who sometimes made her room feel angry and unsettling when they were upset. She even provided names, appearances, and distinct behaviors for each. Although she had drawn them multiple times, she always discarded the drawings. One pair she mentioned were Angelina and Angelica, twin porcelain dolls who urged her to draw them as they looked when they were alive. I recall her mentioning a teenage male presence, but my attention was mainly focused on her expressions of bewilderment. When I asked her how long she had been seeing these entities, she responded approximately 4 to 5 months. Surprisingly, she seemed to invalidate her childhood fear of demons, displaying no recollection of what I remember. At some point during our conversation, either prompted by me or by her musings, she considered the possibility that it all might be a figment of her imagination and uncertainty she grappled with. I reassured her that while watching her speak, I genuinely believed her perception of what she saw, whether it originated from her imagination or an external source. She asked me, "Am I crazy?" I responded by explaining the various perspectives one could take. Alternatively, in a spiritual context, Some might believe she genuinely perceived something beyond our ordinary senses. She nodded, accepting the range of perspectives to consider. Moving forward, I suggested that if she draws or writes about her experiences, she should share them with me. In turn, I would do the same to document everything for future reference. I don't know what I would do or how I would react if my kid had an imaginary sibling. First of all, no. Second of all, porcelain dolls, I'm already tapped out. I would have to call my husband in on that one because I do not mess with dolls, period. Well, that wraps up my portion of this episode. The remainder of the episode will feature my friends and their hauntingly good tales. Stay tuned.
Hey, I'm Brendan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
And we're the Ghost Story Guys. This story comes from our episode, The Mystery of Missing Time. It's called Orange Light. My parents live in a large house in Pennsylvania that backs up to a large wooded area and one house that sits a bit farther back than ours into the woods. The downstairs is probably 2,500 to 3,000 square feet, and there are numerous big windows, including bay windows in the living room above the blinds that look out into the woods. This probably happened about 9 years ago. My sister was around 11 or 12, and I was about 20. I was watching her a couple nights while my parents were out of town. It's worth noting that my parents never went away, so I do find it odd that it happened the one time they did. It wasn't too late at night, maybe around 11, and we were sitting with every light off downstairs, specifically watching lightning bugs out those big bay windows and just talking. All of a sudden, there was a huge burst of orange light with no sound that filled up the entire downstairs like someone had turned the lights on, but even brighter than normal. It was almost a deep orange, and my first reaction was that our house or the neighbor's house behind us had caught on fire. We both got up to run outside, and that's the last memory I have of that evening. I know we woke up the next day as normal, went to my old high school's basketball game and had people over after. There was absolutely no discussion about the night before. Fast forward to about 2 years ago. My sister, who was now about 18, and I were sitting around the kitchen center island talking. All of a sudden, I got a burst of memories from that night, but only what I just mentioned above. I blurted out to my sister, "Wait, what happened that night with the orange light?" And she immediately knew what I was talking about. Turns out she had had a memory just the night before that she didn't connect until that moment. Here we had 7 years since this incident, where we both never said a word to each other, and then we both suddenly had memories within the same 24 hours. It's worth saying that my sister can be oddly psychic and just aware of things that are completely foreign or unknown to others. She also reported seeing things in our house as a kid. Her vision, or dream, from the night before was of us running out the back door, which we ran out of that evening, and there being a large green glowing orb on the driveway. That's where her vision ends. It wasn't until I brought up the orange light that it clicked in her head that that was that night. I guess she was viewing it as just a dream before, but in that moment she realized it was actually a memory. What's especially weird about all this is that my sister and I are very interested in the paranormal, especially things which are space-related, and there is absolutely no way we would have just walked back in after that odd experience and gotten in bed without any discussion. I know we would have offered many theories, as we have now, instead of just ignoring it and getting in our separate beds. What's also weird is that my sister and I both never go to bed before midnight 1 a.m., and if I'm home, we usually sleep in the same bed, falling asleep watching a movie or something. Given where we woke up the next morning, I know for sure that we went to our own beds that night. I've tried to rationalize what happened, like thinking about headlights turning around in the further house's driveway, but they don't match the lights at all. I mean, this was like a nuclear explosion bright, lighting the entire downstairs a deep, deep orange. However, even more than that, I'm weirded out by our completely uncharacteristic reaction to what happened. The reason I chose that particular story out of our archive is I have had my own green light experience, and I don't know that I would say it's specifically UFO related, but it was unusual and I don't have an explanation for it. If you'd like to know more about that, come check out me and Paul over on the Ghost Story Guys podcast, or check out my book, A Strange Little Place, The Paranormal Secrets of Revelstoke, British Columbia.
Hello listeners, my name's Kev and I'm the host of We Need to Talk About Ghosts. You can see what I've done there. It's meant to be We Need to Talk About Kevin. I've removed the word Kevin and added ghosts, because that's the sort of humour and wit you can expect. Yes, very low. Anyway, if you're into the paranormal, as you clearly are because you're listening to this show, head over to wherever you get your podcast from and search We Need to Talk About Ghosts. And hopefully you'll like it. You might not, and that's fine too, because we're all just living on a spinning crazy rock. Anyway, each week we read out some of our true listener ghost stories, we review something paranormal, doesn't matter what it is, could be an egg, if it was a paranormal egg, and then we delve into the depths of Reddit to hear about spooky stuff going on over there. So if you like it, go check us out, search wherever you get your podcasts, We Need to Talk About Ghosts. Tatty bye. My name's Kev from We Need to Talk About Ghosts, and I'm going to regale to you some of the paranormal experiences experienced by my mother. Now, she sadly passed on whilst I was quite young, but she is the reason why I have an interest in the paranormal. She was a believer herself, and she experienced quite a few things. Some of those things I'm going to tell you now. So the first one that jumps out is when she was a teenager, she was babysitting her nieces and nephews, and they didn't really come from a well-off area, so when she was babysitting them, they'd all be in the same bed, and she recalls falling asleep one night, but waking up because she could hear one of the children giggling and mumbling, and when she turned around, the child was sat up in bed, staring at a rocking chair which was in the corner, and smiling and nodding and laughing with its eyes closed, thank you very much, and the chair then started to rock. At which point, me mum picked all the kids up, ran downstairs, phoned her uncle, who came over with his Alsatian or German Shepherd, you know the type of dog I mean, not afraid of anything. And he comes through the door, he marches upstairs with the dog dug its claws in at the line of the bedroom. So where that metal strip is, which separates the carpet, it wouldn't go any further and it was whimpering. Now, this was the late 60s, and let's just say that animals weren't treated with the same dignity that we treat them today. So he picks up the animal by its fur and throws it into the room, as if to say, what are you scared about? The dog then yelps like it's being kicked, runs past my uncle down the stairs, out through the front door, and is found 2 miles away, completely knackered, completely breathless. It's not stopped running since whatever it encountered in that room. And apparently as the dog ran past my mother's uncle, he turned and watched with his own eyes as the rocking chair continued to rock and then come to a stop. So, what was in that room? We'll literally never know. A second tale that she told me was when she was buying shoes for her sister's wedding, and my mother's mother died when my mother was about 2 years old. So she was brought up by her elder sisters. So she never really met her mother in true terms. She had no recollection of her. Anyway, she goes to a shoe shop in Liverpool city centre. And it's a quiet morning. She gets up pretty early. She's in the shop for bang on 9 o'clock. It's the middle of the week. Town's pretty dead. She goes into this shoe shop and she's looking at the shoes and she's thinking, she's trying to pick which ones. She decides on a pair, and through the rack, she sees this woman and she thinks, I know this woman. I don't know how, but I know this woman. Anyway, the woman walks around the counter and says to her, they don't suit you them, love. I wouldn't buy them. Go with the yellow ones. So my mum goes, oh, okay then. And then picks up the yellow ones and tries them on. And as she's trying them on, she thinks, that's kind of a cheeky thing to say to someone that you don't know. They don't suit you. So she looks up and around and this woman's nowhere to be seen. She goes out of the shop and looks left and right. And given the time scale of the woman saying these words and my mum going out of the shop, there's literally nowhere she could have went. But she wasn't there. Now, when she came back and gave a description of what she was wearing and how her hair was, her 2 older sisters broke down in tears and said, that was your mum. Your mum's come and gave you advice on shoes to wear for a wedding. So that was another little tidbit that she told me. The final 2 sort of anecdotes, which are rather short from my mother, was when she and my dad first moved into their first house, which was built on an old ammunition site which was bombed during the war. And it was built as a new estate over this decimated building with God knows how many deaths that took place there. Anyway, this new estate was built. They moved in, and there was a lot of mysterious activity within the house. They'd heard people running up and down the stairs. Go and check, there's no one there. And the infamous story she told was of washing her hair over the bath and being slapped on the backside. And she obviously startled, jumped, ran down the stairs to give me dad a load of grief. And when she burst into the living room, my dad was in the back garden, and my elder brother, who was about 6 months old, was in his crib. So there was no one else in the house, yet she was slapped on the backside. Now, interestingly, her neighbour at the back of her house used to only do the housework of a night. So she would hoover of a night, and she would do all the noisy sort of moving things around and wiping windows and anything she could do to stay active and create a bit of noise, which is the key thing, because her partner worked nights. And as cruel as this sounds, she wanted her children to remain awake until her partner returned home, so that she wasn't alone in the house with the kids whilst they were asleep. So she would purposefully try and keep them awake by hoovering about 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. But the reason for this was, when she was alone in the house during the day, things would just move of their own accord. If she tried to hoover around the house, the plug would be yanked out of the socket, lights would go on and off. My mother even went round one afternoon and knocked on the door, didn't get an answer, so peered through the window to see if she was about, and looked and seen that she was under the table, hiding under the table. So she knocked on the window until she got her attention, and she ran to the front door and answered it in a big panicky state and said, "Something's in the kitchen. It's been throwing pots and pans around. I didn't know what to do. I froze. I jumped under the table, and I was just going to wait here until somebody came." And when my mum and her went and checked, as she says, there was pots and pans all over the kitchen floor. So yeah, just an interesting few stories there. But as my mother also used to say, it's not the dead we should be afraid of, it's the living. And that is something I truly still believe to this day. She also said, if you want to see a ghost, you will see a ghost. Now, sadly, she's no longer with us, so I don't know exactly what she meant by that, but it probably means it's down to your belief level on what you witness and how you interpret it. But I'll leave you with that. There you go. Tatty bye.
Hey, we're Weekly Creep.
I'm Adam.
I'm Dulce.
And Weekly Creep is a show where we delve deep into all of the craziness from the paranormal world and beyond, and also sometimes true crime.
And other stuff we just delve into because we think it's really interesting and we just want to share it with you.
Yeah.
For example, I have a story. I wish I could tell you this was an extraordinary night. Something special happened. I saw my cat do a backflip, but it was nothing of the sort. It was a very ordinary night. I woke up in the middle of the night, 2 steps, heels specifically, walking down from the living room into the hallway, which was in my view. And at my feet, I see Pork Chop looking in the same direction, alert, focused. Like I don't ever remember seeing her. Unless she's looking at some sort of bottle cap or a spider, but it was none of that. After I heard these heels, a memory came to mind. Back a few years ago, my sister used to live in the same house. And in her 20s, in her heyday, she would dress up to the nines and she'd go out. And that's the only time that I'd ever remember hearing heels like that rapidly walking around the house. It sounded like it was 2015 and she had forgotten something. And she ran back into the house to grab whatever lipstick or perfume she had forgotten before heading out into the night with her friends. But then I remembered it was 2023. So here I am in bed, alert, terrified, because it was those very steps that woke me and I knew it wasn't a dream. So I turn over and I shove Adam because he was dead asleep. And I tell him, someone's in the house. He turns over. Voice is just full of sleep. And he said, "Go back to sleep. You're dreaming." And I completely disregard his comment because I know I'm not crazy. And that wasn't a dream. After I figured he'd be completely useless and of no help at all, I decided that I'm going to put on my big girl panties. And if I find someone in the house, I'm going to scream at the top of my lungs and alert everyone in the house. So I get out of the bed and I check every room and I find nothing and no one out of the ordinary. Relieved, I get back into bed and I'm about to fall asleep until I look down and I see Pork Chop still focused in the hallway where I had once heard those steps.
I decided I didn't want to tell one of my own personal stories, rather one of my family member stories. And the reason why is because this one has stuck out to me for years and years, and I've never heard anything quite like it. So, I'm asking you all, if you have ever heard anything like this, to reach out to me, Weekly Creep, on Instagram, and let me know what you think. Way back in the day, sometime in the early 60s, my grandmother and her sister-in-law are walking back to my grandfather's family home. As they get into the neighborhood, they can see the house not even 100 meters away from them, so they decide to cross the road. But as soon as they put their foot on the street, the house is on fire, or at least the huge bush directly outside the house catches fire instantaneously. Terrified, they jump back on the sidewalk. Now, at this point, they're thinking, oh my God, the whole house is burning down. But as soon as they stand back on the path, the flames are gone. The house is untouched. They do it again. The flames erupt as if someone's just poured a load of petrol on the bush and the house itself. This goes on for an unknown amount of time. My grandmother says it could have been 5 minutes, an hour. She literally lost track of all time. But eventually it stops and they're able to go to the house. They tell everybody about it, and kind of the way a lot of ghost stories go, I'm calling this a ghost story because what else do you call it? It kind of just gets forgotten about, not talked about anymore. Until a few months later, my grandfather finds out that his older brother, who had lived in England at the time, had passed away in a house fire. This event had happened months previously, but because there was no telephones or even any family ties really back then, like once you went to England or America or wherever, for a lot of people, that was it. So by the time the family actually found out, he was already long buried in a cemetery in England. So like I said, I'm not really sure what this story is. I call it a ghost story because I genuinely don't know what else to call it. But if you have experienced or even heard of anybody else who has experienced something like this, please reach out, let me know. I'm so curious about this. Like I said, you can find Weekly Creep on Instagram to message us directly. If you want to listen to us, check us out on all of the podcast places. Weekly Creep everywhere.
Hey, this is Nate.
And this is Melissa, and this is You Can See Me in the Dark, a podcast about true ghost stories directly from the people who experience them.
We have new stories out monthly with bonus content on our Patreon if you can't get enough. And we got a killer theme song.
I'm Melissa Sweezy.
And I'm Nate Reitzman, and this is You Can See Me in the Dark.
You can see me in the dark. In our most recent episode, Noah tells a terrifying story about growing up in the most haunted house in Bristol, England. This story is about what happened after he left. You Can See Me in the Dark presents Noah.
I worked at a care home for old folks for a while, and it was a very old building. Like, it used to be a workhouse, a Victorian workhouse. And that place was really haunted. Like, oof, I didn't like it there. I really didn't like it there. There was a corridor in the like main building of the care home, and as soon as you walked through, there was like a security door, because the residents had dementia, so they would have doors so they couldn't just walk out, for safety. As soon as you walked through the door and stood in that like corridor, it was just this like horrible sensation just washes over you, and everything feels heavy. It's like almost like a pressure pressing down on you, and I hated being in that corridor. And they had a vicar come to like bless this corridor, and he had come and hung a like little wooden cross on the wall after he blessed it. And every now and then, for no reason at all, the cross would be turned upside down, or it would fall and just be on the floor. And certain members of staff refused to go in that corridor. They just would not go in there, ever. And this corridor, there were like eight bedrooms off of this corridor. And the residents had these like pressure sensitive mats next to their bed. So if they got out of bed, it would set an alarm off, and we would know they'd got out of bed. So then we could go and see to them. And sometimes when I worked a night shift, me and the other staff would be sat like drinking coffee, trying to stay awake. And all of a sudden, every single alarm for every room in that corridor would all go off all at the same time. And the first time it happened, I was like, come on, we all got to get up, everyone's awake. And one of the other staff was like, no, they're not. They're not awake. And I was like, what are you talking about? They're not, all of the alarms are going off. We need to go up there. And she's like, they're not awake. You can go up and look, but I can bet you they're all still in bed. And I was like, all right then. So I went up by myself in the dark, turning all the lights on as I went, because I was scared, because I hated that hallway. And I go into the hallway, open the first door. No, residents in bed fast asleep. Turn the alarm off. Open the next door. Residents in bed fast asleep. Turn the alarm off. And the whole time it's like beep, beep, beep. And I'm going door after door after door after door. Everyone is asleep in bed. And I'm thinking, how are all of these alarms being set off? Like, what is setting these alarms off? But after that, like, it just was kind of like a known thing. Like, yeah, that happens. That happens all the time, There's no need to rush, because nobody knows what it is, but something is just messing with us, I guess. But that corridor, another time I was putting laundry away. I used to take laundry and take it to the wardrobes in each room. And I stopped in the end room, and like I had these huge buckets or baskets of clothes, dry clothes. I leave it in the first room, and then I go to the next room. I like grab stuff and I go into the next room. And then I hear this almighty crash, and I'm thinking, what in the hell? What was that? It sounds like someone's trashing the room next door. And I'm thinking, but there's no one there. And I go out into the next room and I open the door, and someone has grabbed these 2 baskets of laundry and just thrown clothes everywhere. And just all over the room. And I'm like, what the hell? What did that? There's no one here. Like, there's no residents, there's no staff members. Like, what the hell is going on? And I'm like grabbing all the clothes and folding them and putting them back in the basket. And while I'm doing that, I hear another sound in the room I just came from. And I'm like, someone is pranking me. Like, someone is absolutely pranking me right now. So I pull the door open, I go really quietly, and I creep out. I go to the door and I just swing the door open, and the clothes that I'd just taken into that room have been thrown everywhere. And I just stand there and look at it, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. Like, there's no one here. I'm on my own. Something is messing with me, and I don't know what it is, but it's definitely screwing with me now. So I grabbed the clothes and stuffed them in the basket, and I took the baskets and I left and went back down to the laundry room. I was like, I'm not doing this now. This is too weird. I know that other weird things had happened to other staff members. Nobody said anything about that happening to them specifically, but I know other times that staff members had gone into a room and they'd heard a noise in the next room, and when they'd gone in there, someone had opened the wardrobe and everything was on the floor. So like whoever or whatever was there liked making a mess and seemed to enjoy watching, because it would be like it would trick you to go into the other room, and while you're in that room it would do something in the room you'd just been in. Like, yeah, it was kind of like it was pranking. It made me uncomfortable, I will say. I felt afraid, but it was almost like almost like I could imagine someone being like, hee hee, this is so funny, like they're gonna go and look in the other room now, and while they're in there I'm gonna mess around in the other room. Very strange. But there was one story that kind of circulated amongst the staff. It was kind of like the most popular, I guess, ghost story, and it was a couple of years back when this hallway with the horrible sensation was actually like a newly converted part of the building. And when it had been converted, and decorators had come in to like paint it and, you know, prepare it so it could be used, and there's two guys up there working, and one of them comes down to the like main office and is like, I can't work up here with all these children running around. They're knocking things over, they're getting in the way, like this is dangerous, there shouldn't be kids here right now. And the receptionist looks at him, she's like, what are you talking about? Like, there are no kids here. And he's like, no, I just saw there's like 2 or 3 kids up there, and they're running around and they're just making so much noise, like we're trying to work here. And she's like, I really don't know why you're saying that, because there are no kids here. This is an old folks home, there are no kids. And he was like, oh, okay. And then the next day, these 2 guys were supposed to come back and continue their work, and they didn't come back. I don't know. I've heard that the building, like, it was a workhouse. So it's possible that the children were sent there and possibly died there, possibly. I know the building, there was like a sort of outside building that wasn't connected to the main building, where the like laundry room was. And I know that they would sleep there. And sometimes late in the evening, you would hear coughing coming from somewhere. I would be there on my own, like getting clean laundry, and I would hear someone like really coughing, like, oh my God, if they got pneumonia or something. But there's no one there. Yeah. It's a really spooky place. I think it was the clothes getting thrown around the room was the last straw for me, because it was kind of like, not only is this scary, but it's making more work for me. Because we were stretched quite thin a lot of the time, and there wasn't time to deal with these kind of mishaps. Yeah, and also I really didn't like being in that corridor at night. I did not feel safe in that corridor, and like I'm not religious, but walking into that corridor at like 1 o'clock in the morning and seeing the cross lying on the floor is a really unsettling feeling. I imagine for anyone, whether they're religious or not, just seeing that and being like, this feels threatening. I'm glad I left.
Hey there, I'm Jennifer, and I host Haunted Happenstance, a creepy and quirky little audio drama set in a historic residence in Boston, Massachusetts. You see, I've always loved a good ghost story, and as it turns out, ghosts have always loved me too. Convenient? Maybe. Coincidence? Perhaps. But I think it's a bit more than that. Let's see if you agree. So sit back and get ready to join me and my neighbors for some truly spooky tales that can only be explained as Haunted Happenstance. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find your podcasts. I stared at the clock on my bedside. It was 11:56 p.m. on Monday, September 30th, 2019, 4 minutes away from October the 1st. Sure, I was looking forward to the month, even more so for real fall to hopefully creep in, but I was not looking forward to what else I knew would be creeping in at exactly midnight. I stared out into the all but black space that was our lofted condo, the slightest sliver of hazy light slipping in under the front door from the perma-lit brick hallway, and I just clicked my tongue lightly, almost mimicking a countdown ticker. At least this year I had a plan. I was pretty certain it wouldn't last the whole month, but any day that it did work was one more day and night that I could breathe a little easier and, heaven forbid, actually enjoy my favorite month for once. Although I couldn't see it in the dark, I knew that just out of reach was a small tote bag, complete with a few basic necessities and a few extra things that hopefully wouldn't be necessary at all, short of a horrific emergency, but better safe than sorry. 11:59. Perfect. So close. I held my breath in anticipation and watched as the numbers flicked over to 12 o'clock. I exhaled and tried to slip my legs out of bed without disrupting either of the snoozers. Luckily, John could sleep through the apocalypse, and Sophie was pretty much deaf, at least when it suited her. I reached down in the dark and let my fingers slip through the handles of the pre-packed bag and turned to my side. I waved to the dirty blonde boy in his late teens, his dirt-smeared light green t-shirt and lightly torn dungarees the same as they always were. I tilted my head towards the kitchen, beckoning him to follow me, and he did, without sound or question. I turned our front doorknob as slowly as possible and opened it just enough so I could slip out into the hall without the hinges breaking their creaking halfway point. Holding onto the external handle, I let the door slide naturally back into the threshold and then turned to the boy. In the bright lights of the hall, the smallest trickle of dried blood could be seen emerging from the part in his crumpled hair. He wore only one shoe, a muddy red original low-top Chuck Taylor, his right foot bare, filthy and scratched. Thankfully, we didn't have to go far, and even more thankfully, I was pretty sure he couldn't feel anything anyway. I motioned for him to follow me, I adjusted the bag on my shoulder, and we headed down the 4th floor hall in the direction of the back elevator. Stopping short a few doors of it, I looked at him with the warmest smile I had in my repertoire, made sure my eyes were light and genuine, and finally spoke. "Don't worry, you'll be okay, I promise." He nodded and stood more primly. I cleared my throat and straightened my own posture to mirror his, and I knocked my fist solidly against one of my neighbor's doors. When no sound or movement came from the other side, I brought my knuckles back together and this time knocked with a more pleasant cadence. Some shuffling and stumbling was immediately audible, along with a mumbled curse or two, and within a moment, the door opened slowly, uncertainly, and revealed a half-asleep, middle-aged man, my neighbor, Benjamin. I think it was safe to say that seeing me outside his door at midnight was perplexing to him, but nowhere near as disorienting as when his eyes fell to my companion. I sighed a little, figuratively and literally. Oh good, you can see him. Hey, sorry to bother you so late, Ben, but you kept saying at the loft's last block party that you thought it was so cool that ghosts visited me, and you wish that they'd visit you too. Well, you're in luck. This fine young man right here needs somewhere to stay for the month, and unfortunately, I just don't have the space for him this year. Benjamin tore his eyes off of me as I spoke, and stared instead to the lad to my side, half in amazement, half in terror. I figured I ought to wrap things up quickly, lest he wake up enough to scream, or worse, tell me and my friend to beat it. I handed over the bag that I carried. Here's everything you should need to get through, and if you have any questions, just text, okay? Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. At that, I ducked backwards a few steps and headed back home. I tiptoed back into our condo and snuck into bed, impressed that I'd completed the delivery in less than 7 minutes flat. Feeling hopeful, a little nervous, but mostly tired, I sighed heavily as I wiggled deeper into my pillow. John rolled over, eyes still half closed, and asked if everything was okay. I nodded. Yeah, it's all good. Go back to sleep, baby doll. He looked at the clock and asked through a yawn, Where's Christian? As he settled his head back down. I brought him to Benjamin's for the month. I think it's a good match. Even in the darkness, I could tell that John had brought a hand up and over his eyes. Jen, you can't just loan people ghosts. He was poking fun at you when he said he wanted to see them too. I shrugged my shoulders, rolled onto my side, and as I fell into a happy, relieved, and slightly less haunted sleep, I mumbled, Well, I guess the joke's on him this time.
Hello, my name is Emma and I am the host of Real Life Ghost Stories podcast. Real Life Ghost Stories is a podcast that covers all sorts of spooky stuff, all sorts of spooky goodness. Every Sunday I do a deep dive into a famous paranormal case or claim, and every Wednesday and Friday I release a mini episode that is chock full of listener stories. The story that you are going to hear from Real Life Ghost Stories podcast comes from episode number 181, The Connecticut Dolls, which is all about an old poltergeist story that I unearthed in my travels, and I hope you enjoy it. Mesmerism is not a term that we use particularly regularly in today's modern parlance. But in the 18th century, it was all the rage and was at the forefront of contemporary psychology. The technique was popularised in the 1700s by Franz Anton Mesmer and was used as a way to cure people of various ailments. Mesmer believed that animal magnetism was the key to this cure, and the procedure involved the application of magnets to the part of the patient's body that was affected by the particular ailment, and then the patient would be put into a trance-like state by gazing into their eyes and making what he called magnetic passes over them with his hands. It was so popular that the words mesmerised and variations of it have stuck around, and eventually mesmerism was superseded by what we now know as hypnotism. The reason we have to start here is that I need to explain to you what kind of man Reverend Eliakim Phelps was. It was 1850, and Reverend Phelps was a very well-respected man, but he was also a great believer in all things paranormal, which, in 1850, would not have been wholly unusual. He was a practitioner of mesmerism and would cure people of various ailments using the method, so it's safe to say that the forces of good and evil and non-scientific reasons for various phenomena were a pretty substantial part of his life. Later in life, Reverend Phelps had married for a second time, and the woman he married was a widow with 4 children. The children were a girl aged 16, a boy aged 11, a girl aged 6, and another boy aged 3. And our story begins on the 10th of March 1850. It was a Sunday in Stratford, Connecticut, and the weather was beginning to turn. You could feel a tiny hint of warmth in the crisp spring air, and a breeze blustered as the Phelps family made their way home after church. People of the town called their greetings and blessings to the Reverend and his family as they made their way home. The second that the Reverend opened the door to their home, he realised that something was very wrong. Their house had been ransacked, and his heart sank as he realised that someone must have broken into the house while the family was at church. He urged his family to wait at the door, and as they craned their necks to see the carnage inside, he took a slow, cautious step into the house, feeling a mixture of panic and confusion, but trying to remain calm and clear-headed. He worried that the perpetrator would be inside. Was it someone who was looking for something? Maybe someone passing through the town and saw an opportunity, or someone who bore a grudge against him or his family. But surely that was impossible. As he made his way from room to room, the different possible scenarios vied for attention in his head. Each room had been ransacked, with furniture flung around and the contents of drawers and cupboards strewn all over the floors. He moved through the house, room by room, and he placed the palm of his hand on a door and slowly pushed it open to survey the damage. But what he saw in that room made him catch his breath. He held the door open, not daring to take a step inside while his brain tried to comprehend what he was seeing. In the room, a scene had been painstakingly created, and for a brief moment, he thought that the room was full of women. Real women. But they weren't real. These women were dolls. Well, almost like dolls. They were women that had been painstakingly fashioned out of clothes and items of fabric that were clearly belonging to the Phelps family home. The women were littered around the room in poses of extreme devotion, on their knees praying, some with their arms out and their foreheads touching the floor. Some of the figures were kneeling with Bibles open in front of them. Phelps stepped into the room and looked at the Bible verses, immediately desperate for some clue as to what was happening here. The Bibles were all opened on pages with verses that seemed to reference paranormal phenomenon. As the Reverend surveyed the scene, he counted that there were 10 female figures and 1 male. And then something else. Something in the middle of the circle of worship that was not like the others. It was a small, goblin-like creature, smaller than the others and truly grotesque. And suspended above it was an even smaller figure, like a puppet. Phelps stepped backwards out of the room and shut the door. It's hard to imagine how any of us would respond in that situation. The family had been at church, all together, and someone had somehow entered their home and ransacked it, but had also created this elaborate and strange tableau. Whatever had happened, he needed to figure it out for the safety of his family, and what he did next is the reason that we even know this story today. He got other learned people involved in an attempt to solve the mystery. His first port of call was a man named Dr. Webster, another well-respected man in the community, who knew both the Reverend and his family. Dr. Webster ended up being so struck by the events of the next 18 months that he wrote extensively about it in the New Haven Journal and Courier. A watch was set up to try and establish who was responsible for these events, but the figures continued to appear, Rooms that were closed and monitored would suddenly have these figures appear inside them. Webster noted that the figures were made from materials that were gathered from all over the house, and that so many figures were constructed in such a small space of time that it would have taken several people working steadily for several hours to pull it off. The figures varied from being beautiful and grotesque, and were always arranged in some sort of scene. It is estimated that during this period of time, approximately 30 individual intricate figures were created. One of the Phelps sons was led into one of the rooms to survey the scene, and ran straight to what he believed was his mother kneeling in prayer in the room. As he grabbed her joined hands, he reeled back in shock as the material crumpled in his little hands, and he realised that it wasn't his mother at all, but yet another figurine that, despite being made from fabric, was lifelike enough to fool him. They were made with great skill and care, and didn't seem to be thrown together in a haphazard fashion. The fact that this child could mistake one of these figures for his own mother demonstrates how accurate and lifelike they actually were. And the figures weren't the only disturbance in the house. Webster wrote in his report of the events that, quote, for about 18 months, violent movements and disturbances were renewed with extreme frequency and force. Objects of all kinds were thrown around the house by what seemed to be invisible hands. Window panes were broken, and great damage was done to the walls and furnishings of the home. Rappings were constantly heard, and these sometimes gave intelligent and sometimes blasphemous answers to questions that were asked. It seemed from Webster's report that the Phelps family were at war with something disturbing, invisible, and otherworldly, and something that desperately wanted to communicate with them, and would go to any lengths to do so. But life had to continue as normal for the Phelps family too. In all of the worry about the strange events in the home, life goes on. Reverend Phelps needed to continue his work and his writings. The children needed to be fed and educated, and the household needed to be ran efficiently. Reverend Phelps sat alone in his office writing, hunched over his desk. The only sound was the furious scratching of his pen as he worked diligently, his hand racing across the pages. The house was calm and quiet, which seemed like a luxury these days, and for once he allowed his mind to focus on his work rather than the horror of the invisible aggressor that had moved in with them. He briefly stopped writing, paused for a second in his chair before standing up and moving to his impressive array of books that sat on his shelves. He ran his finger along them before settling on a book and taking it down. As he opened it, he became aware of another sound in the room other than the rustle of turning pages. It was the scratching of his pen on the paper. He turned around and there was no one in his seat, and the pen was lying lifeless where he had left it. But when he approached his desk, cautiously he realised that his page was now covered in writing that wasn't there a mere minute before. The Reverend ran his fingers softly over the newly formed words, and the ink stained his fingers. It was not yet dry. This was finished mere seconds before, and the words were a strange jumble of words and phrases and symbols that he didn't understand. It was the words and symbols that were a repeated pattern, but none of the family or observers could have expected what happened next, as the invisible aggressor attempted to communicate yet again. It was again a calm and quiet evening, and the family were allowing themselves to be a normal family. It was one of the children that spotted it first as he dropped to his knees to examine something that seemed to be growing from the carpet. "Mother, there are plants in the carpet, and there are pictures on the leaves." Mrs. Phelps looked at her husband and he looked back at her. What did that possibly mean? As they looked at the carpet, they realised that green shoots had sprung up everywhere, all over the carpet. They dropped to the floor to examine the plants further, and on the leaves were strange symbols, some form of hieroglyphic-style pictures that were indecipherable. None of the family spoke as they looked at the plants, all completely enraptured by what they were seeing. They didn't recognise the plants. They didn't understand what the symbols were on the leaves or how they got there. The silence was only broken when the smash of shattering glass heralded that yet something else had been hurled through a window. What is remarkable about this case is that the witness testimonies came thick and fast. One witness, named Mr. H.B. Taylor, reported that he saw the following. Quote, "In my presence, the elder boy was carried across the room by invisible hands and deposited gently on the floor. A supper table was raised and tipped over when the room was completely empty to people. In one instance, the boy's clothes were cut to ribbons. In the presence of several persons, articles moved through the air and a brass candlestick fell from the mantelpiece and continued to dash itself against the floor until broken. A shovel and tongs set moved out of the fireplace and then proceeded to hop about and dance in the middle of the floor. A heavy dining room table was raised into the air and a lamp moved across the room and set fire to some papers. On a later occasion, the boy was found hung to a tree, and the elder girl, while sleeping, had a pillow pressed over her head and tape tied around her neck which nearly strangled her." Another report came from Professor Austin Phelps, who was the son of Reverend Phelps from his previous marriage. He reported that, quote, "On one occasion, when Reverend Phelps was alone, walking across the room, a key and a nail flew over his head and fell at his feet. That same evening, in the presence of the whole family, a turnip fell from the ceiling. Spoons and forks flew from the table into the air, and one day, 6 or 8 spoons were taken up at once, bent double by the invisible agency, and thrown at those in the room. On another occasion, when Reverend Phelps was alone, he was directed by the raps to put his hand under the table, and his hand was grasped by what seemed to be a human hand, warm and soft. Most of the raps purported to come from a Frenchman named D, who had been a clerk for a firm of lawyers who had handled a settlement for Mrs. Phelps. D asserted that he was in hell because he had cheated in the drawing of the settlement papers. Reverend Phelps investigated and did find that there had been fraud perpetrated, though not involving a sum sufficiently large enough to warrant a prosecution. A Reverend Charles Beecher made similar statements about the legitimacy of the case in a report published in 1879, and a man named Andrew Jackson Davis visited the family in Stratford and believed that the phenomena was the result of psychic manifestations from the eldest boy and girl in the household, although he absolutely insisted the events were paranormal. The New York Sun published an article on April the 29th, 1850, in which the journalist, Mr. Beach, reported that he was witness to the paranormal phenomena in the house. He visited the house in the early days of the events, and the elder boy was sitting up in bed with a number of adults in the room investigating the phenomena. They watched as a matchbox fell from the mantelpiece with a bizarrely loud thunk. All eyes were on it as it slid across the floor and under the boy's bed. The boy began to scream and cry that he was being burned, and upon investigation, some paper under the bed had been set on fire and was burning away beneath it. Mr. Beach also reported witnessing spontaneous injuries appear on the elder girl. For example, she would complain of feeling as though she was being pinched, and when she rolled up her sleeves, there were vivid red marks on her arms. The New Haven Journal also reported that they witnessed the girl being spontaneously injured, with her screaming in her bedroom, claiming that she had been slapped in the face and a large red welt appeared on her face. When the reporter watched the family try and comfort her, a porcelain jug rose from a table, floated in the air for a few seconds before being smashed on the ground with huge force. But eventually, the activity in the house began to subside. And in October 1851, around 18 months after the activity started, it stopped altogether. The response was mixed. When the stories were reported in newspapers and journals, people were quick to suggest that the children were very clearly the perpetrators of a clever hoax. But Reverend Phelps insisted that it just wasn't possible. And another witness, Reverend John Mitchell, reported that he accompanied the family to and from their home, and he witnessed the house being intact upon leaving and then being ransacked when they returned. And he insisted that it was not possible that any of the family were responsible. They were all out of the house at the time. And he also claimed to have witnessed writing appearing on the walls and the clothing of the family when none of the family were in the house.
Hi, I'm Chris, the host of They're Not Shadows, a paranormal story podcast. This story is titled The Old Farm. I'm an engineer, and I don't believe in ghosts. I'm convinced they couldn't exist due to several laws of physics. Yet, something happened that I can't explain. My brother told me he'd been to an abandoned farmhouse with his partner and had an experience. As they were standing inside this very old house, she asked him,
"Do you really think this place is haunted?"
And before he could reply, he said the house shook.
Oh my God! What's happening?
I don't know!
I didn't think he was lying, but I was concerned he was delusional. So I decided to check out this farmhouse for myself. I was with a former colleague, a guy with a PhD in physics, who also does not believe in ghosts. It was a bright sunny day. And as we arrived, we could hear the wind, the nearby sheep, and the birds chirping. But as we approached the house, it all stopped. It was so sudden and obvious, we both commented.
Did you notice how...
Yeah, I did.
We kept going, and out of an adjacent, open-sided barn, a flock of crows flew out, as if they were disturbed by something. It was like a cliché scene from a horror movie.
That was weird.
Yeah, weird.
We got to the house. It appeared to have been abandoned for at least half a century. What furniture remained was very old, from around the Second World War. And there was a strong smell of dampness and mold. We explored the upstairs rooms.
Hey, look at this. A newspaper from the 50s. The reopening of the Suez Canal.
1957?
Spot on. March 29th, to be precise.
We came back down and systematically went through every downstairs room. Then, from the empty room that we'd both just been in, we heard something. It was unmistakably the sound of a foot scuffing the floor. We looked at each other. Without a word, we both turned and looked at the open doorway. Then, from it came. There was no furniture in that room. There simply wasn't anywhere anyone could have been hiding in there. It was an empty room.
Should we?
Yeah, we should.
You can make of it what you will. We don't know what to make of it.
Hey y'all, I'm Brandon Schecksnyder from the podcast Southern Gothic. I've got a little story for you from out in West Virginia. Back in the early 19th century, before coal became king and West Virginia was even a state, most folks who came out to this neck of the woods were homesteaders, self-reliant settlers looking to own a piece of land, farm it, and make a life for themselves without all the trappings of city life. So men like Berg Hammond helped them. Hammond was a peddler, a traveling salesman who meandered his way through the region in a wagon filled with items that you otherwise couldn't find unless you took the long journey into town. He sold all sorts of things from clothing to kitchenware, household goods, and even toys. And to folks he sold to, the arrival of his horse-drawn wagon was a welcome sight for sore eyes. The Encyclopedia of West Virginia quotes a woman who grew up in a rural county during the 1880s as saying that visits from peddlers like Berg, quote, gave us something to look forward to. It was almost like having Santa Claus come. We loved to see the big bundle opened up, for we seldom saw new things. But Berg was a little different than some of his peers, because not only did he bring all sorts of traditional wares, but he also carried with him a number of musical instruments, all of which he knew how to play. And for this reason, he didn't really think of himself as a peddler the way his customers did. He believed he was a creative, a musician, out on the road, entertaining folks everywhere he went. But of all the instruments he carried and played, the one that gave him the biggest draw was the fiddle. This, of course, made the sight of Berg coming into a town an even bigger treat than most. He was always received with the utmost excitement and got numerous invitations to stay the night at a local farmer's house, have a hot meal, and a soft bed. But as you can imagine, life on the road out there wasn't easy. Communities were few and far between, and it would sometimes take Berg days to travel between them, on seldom used dirt roads winding through the treacherous mountains of Appalachia. And this was all in a heavy wagon pulled by a couple of old horses. This was a lonely life, and it's no wonder why Berg picked up the fiddle. Unfortunately, after years of making his way through these mountains, the fiddler's good fortune came to an end. According to local lore, one evening Berg was caught out in the rain while traveling along the winding roads of Bud Mountain. worked their way over the peak, he might find a dry place to stop and spend the night. He pressed on. But as the sun began to fade, a deep fog set in, and the path became more and more dangerous as rain fell harder and harder. Berg had no light to guide him, and although he had traveled these roads many times over the years, he soon found that he had somehow drifted off the worn path. It was then, amidst the confusion and darkness, that his horses got spooked. They reared up in terror with fear-filled neighs as Berg attempted to regain control of his wagon. But after sliding backward, it began to tumble down the steep side of Bud Mountain. It took quite a bit of time before folks realized that their favorite fiddle-playing peddler was missing. And it took even longer for them to find him. And when they finally did, they discovered what they had feared. Berg and his horses had met their fate on that stormy night. Yet in spite of his death, old Berg Hammond wasn't done sawing on that fiddle, and it wasn't long till people started to notice. Folks who knew him claimed to hear those familiar melodies echoing through the air on stormy nights. And to this very day, locals claim that he'll even play for you on demand if you just go ahead and ask. Berg Hammond, let's hear some of those pretty tunes.
Well, that does it for this episode. If you'd like to submit your own personal spooky tale to be read on the show, head to hauntedpod.com and click on the link to submit your story. You can also email me at hauntedpod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice. It really does help. You can find us on Twitter for now at podcast_haunted, Instagram at It's Haunted What Now, or at hauntedpod.com. Production assistance provided by Jesse Hawk. And the official composer and audio smith for the show is Nico at We Talk of Dreams. Check him out on Twitter at We Talk of Dreams or wetalkofdreams.com. Until next time. Did you hear that?